So I think there are a few questions that have come up that somebody has asked about diagnosing individual needs straight away in order to understand the types of differentiation. And one thing that I would say about that is, I think when you're working with students, you really want to do a needs analysis as soon as you can. So if you're fortunate, you might work in a school where they do assess needs before a course is put together, but I've found very frequently that that's really not the case, or the kind of standard needs analysis are not enough, and certainly in a private lesson it's not enough. Now, if you can afford to offer students half an hour of literally going over their needs, recording them, reading something, looking at things, asking questions and filling in a big form, I think that that can give you a really good start. But I do hope that one thing that maybe came through from my webinar is that it is a gradual process, and it's a process where you build things. So the whole point of differentiation is about working with the individual, and people change and needs change as you go along. I think, yeah, it being a gradual process, that it's something you need to look at things over a period of time and constantly just make changes, make some adaptation. I think it is really important to learn to differentiate. And I really wish that I'd known more about that early on in my career, because I think particularly when you're very inexperienced, you're just focused on trying to put together a lesson, and it's all about the material. And sometimes it's all about you. Do I know the material? Can I deliver it? And I think it's very easy to just lose a sense of the people in the room or the people online. And I think that you do need to collect data, but I also, my children sometimes say, oh, I can't believe you ask all these questions. And I often say to them, well, I can't believe that you've got a teacher that in December still doesn't know your name when they've been teaching you since September. I think that's unacceptable. So I'd rather be accused of knowing too much than not knowing enough for students. People ask about what can a teacher differentiate. I think you can differentiate almost anything, but one thing I would say, for example, I don't know how much you do this, but if you're teaching a grammar point or a vocabulary point, I would encourage students sometimes to try and take notes rather than just listen to us talk at them. And if you do that, you can make a little sort of script. So perhaps you're doing a lesson on the third conditional. I talk about that because I love conditionals. So let's say we're doing a lesson on conditionals, and maybe I might put some key facts on a little sheet, and I'm going to give my presentation, and my weaker students might have most of what I'm going to say written down already, but just a few little gaps, and they could pick up those bits. Stronger students don't need me to supply them with anything. They do what they want to do. So they can write the examples, they can write down some questions, whatever they like. I think Oksana's got a question about sacrificing attention to weaker students and neglect the strong ones. Absolutely. So reason why differentiation is really of interest to me is I have a scientific experiment in my own home. I've got 3 children, but 2 of them are twins. And I've been really interested to see in the classroom how they work. And one of them is just, you tell her anything and she gets it really quickly. And she spent part of her school time being bored because she wasn't stretched. And then luckily, her school is part of a very big trust, and they really did a lot of work with teachers about stretch and support. So there's always extra activities, there's always something else. So that means that possibly she's left school with certain topics with a lot more knowledge than some other students have, but that was because she was ready for it. And in other topics, maybe she hasn't had so much. So I do think it's important. My concern actually is not the weaker or the stronger students, because I think stronger students are easy to call upon when we're asking questions. They're our go-to students. We know they're going to give us a succinct answer. They're going to be helpful. Our weaker students, we often walk around because we want to support them. I think actually the people that get most left out are all the students in the middle. The people that aren't particularly strong, aren't particularly weak, the kind of average. So I think you have to sort of look at that as well. That's a really important thing. So yeah, tools for developing stronger students are really, really important, Oksana. So yeah, I would say that's an absolute key, and trying to factor that into a lesson all the time. I did also see a question about tools for understanding and implementing differentiation with groups. I think I've covered a lot of this in the webinar, but I think it is really important to consider moving around groups as you become more experienced with teaching, trying to create more of a workshop approach where different people are able to work on different tasks within a lesson. And that allows you to have space to listen to your students, see what they're doing. I think particularly when you're newer to teaching and may be more nervous, the tendency is that everybody always does all the stuff at the same time, because somebody might ask you a question you haven't thought of or you haven't prepared for, and it can be much more scary to be working with different groups doing things at different speeds. But that would be something very, very important to sort of move around a room. Question about it being a successful framework. I think it is successful because actually I think what happens is that really experienced teachers do it automatically. And I think it just becomes, it's sort of like when you're going to make a cup of tea, you don't even think about the process, it's on autopilot. And again, it's the difference between being a new teacher and a more experienced teacher. Experienced teachers, I think, concept check often more thoroughly, and they don't plan it, it just happens. And I think that as you get used to differentiating, but more importantly to personalizing, because a lot of this is about personalization, which is not difficult, it will become automatic and you will gradually look for all those opportunities to do that. I think interesting question about taking too much time. I love questions like this because I hear this again and again, like with exam class as well, like we've only got time to do the exam, we can only do this, we can only do that. For me, it is about quality and not quantity. There is no point in going through a syllabus and going through a lesson if you're only taking a third of your class with you, or also if the content of what you've taught just stays in their short-term memory because you haven't made it memorable enough or personal enough. So you could come back to that in 2 or 3 weeks and everybody's forgotten. So I think it is really important to actually personalize from the outset, take that extra time. And sometimes some of these things literally take 1 second. So when I showed you the slide with the students' names in, that's exactly the same grammar task that is in the book. It's just, it's got their names in. And yes, it took me a few extra minutes on the computer to do it, but the look on the students' faces and seeing their engagement and seeing how meaningful it is and seeing how they're going to actually walk away from the room and keep the handout and not just leave it on the desk. Because when people walk away from a lesson and they don't even take the materials with you, that would be, you know, really, I think it's nice that there's something extra. And I think it's, in a way, it's not a framework in the same way that personalization is not a framework, because differentiation, I think when we talk about frameworks, where people are thinking about, you know, is it a skills lesson, and are we putting the components of a skills lesson? Is it an inductive or a deductive thing? Is it guided discovery? That's a framework to me. But differentiation is actually a methodology that fits on top of everything. So it's useful for all kind of ways of teaching.
What, Anna, if I can have a question, because I remember at the point you were talking about scaffolding students. So what's the relationship between scaffolding and differentiation? Are they the same?
I think differentiation is more broad in that you're giving people choice. I mean, scaffolding is particularly giving the extra support. So that is when you're looking at giving more information, either because somebody hasn't understood, maybe it's particularly complicated, maybe they're not ready for something. Whereas differentiation can just be about coloring something, personalizing it to a need or an age or the age of a student or where they're at. So yeah, I think it is different, and scaffolding is about just it's that thing about the zone of proximal development. It's about giving a student the stepping stone to help them get up to the next step in their learning, and so that they would need a little bit of extra support. And that would be like, for example, where I've just said, if you were teaching a bit about the conditionals and you could give them some notes of what you're going to say, the students that have a lot of notes that are already populated, that is their scaffolding. And the people that don't have anything, they've got a blank piece of paper, they've got no scaffolding. And when we did the little dictation task, you can see different amounts of support or scaffolding by the quantity of information that's provided.
And Anna, before you answer those questions that have just come in, can I just ask one more thing about that graded task? Because I noticed
Sure.
that you, like there were 3 different types of tasks that you created, designed. And I noticed that there were, like, your focus were on various words within the tasks. So you didn't, let's say, remove the exact same words that you read differently.
Yeah.
So how do you go about that?
That's an easy way to differentiate again, I guess. Well, so for example, with the gap fill, you've got to decide what your key focus is. So if I wanted that text to be used for past tenses, then obviously I'm just going to take out the past tense verbs. If I want it to just be a more holistic thing, I could take out every 7th word, every 5th word, longer chunks, shorter chunks, and that's sort of going to, I think that's going to give people a lot of flexibility with how difficult or easy you make. I think it's interesting that sort of Gabby's asking about asking students to do an easier task. So often when I've done graded dictations, I have 2 ways of doing this. So one way will be, I know the students and I want to deliberately stretch some students and other students aren't ready. So if I'm doing that in a physical classroom, those different tasks will be on different colored papers. And I know that I've got my pink group, my green group, my blue group. And I know that the blue group are maybe going to be able to go further than the pink group, but they're all going to wind up taking a similar amount of time just because of the difficulty of the task. So sometimes I'm going to make that executive decision. But there have been times as well when you teach students for long periods of time, and maybe you're towards the end of the term, where I will literally say to people, are you feeling ready to be challenged today? Are you feeling energetic? Put your hand up if you're ready for a challenge. And they get the more difficult task. And okay, you had a really bad night. You went out clubbing last night. You've got a headache. Fine. Today you get the easy task, but tomorrow you're going to get the much harder task. So that would be something I would say. So I think that students generally, I don't think students resent things if you give them something that is achievable. So sometimes people really don't want to be pushed. They need to be motivated by being able to do a task. And therefore an easier task can sometimes be a relief. And also I think that the students, when you do a graded dictation, they're not aware of the pedagogy, the methodology behind it. Then it's not always obvious who are the weaker and stronger students. And particularly the beauty of that task is that if you get students to check their work together rather than you as a teacher giving the final version, actually those stronger students are going to be very reliant on the weaker students who will have more responsibility because they will have more of the original text. So they will be able to give more during the feedback stage. So that's, I think, important. In terms of, Michael's asking about specific resources or books and modifying tasks. You know what? I haven't really come across a huge amount. And I think that's the sort of, I would say, listening to webinars like this and the sort of thing that gallery teachers are doing, this is where you find this kind of stuff, because this is day-to-day practice. It's not the kind of stuff that people are making money on in books. Yes, there are loads of ideas. If you look at things like, well, I believe Luke Meddings is talking on Friday, and he and Scott Thornbury have written an amazing book called Teaching Unplugged. And there are lots of ideas in there about different things with dictations. Dictations in particular are really easy to adapt to different levels. So books about that. There is also Mario Involucri's book on dictation, the Cambridge University Press one. That's quite old now, but that's got some spectacular ideas which are easily adaptable. If people, somebody's saying about, yeah, if a student doesn't like you differentiating things, then I think it's a choice of, you know, are they the customer, they're paying for it? Well, then don't differentiate for them if they don't want something to be a bit different to other people. Or also, I think it's about how you package it. So sometimes you can say to students, you know, I'm giving you this, you know, maybe quietly, not in front of the whole class, say you're ready for a much greater challenge. And I could see that you could really help another student over there. So if you do this and you can double check it with me, and then you can go and work with another group, then you're empowering them and making them feel good about themselves. So differentiation is not about, I think there's a problem with the word differentiation, because it sort of sounds a bit like we're thinking about like disabilities, and the sort of being different can be a word that can be perceived as being negative. But actually, I think rather than differentiation, we should be thinking about choice. and personalisation, because that's what it really means, being individual with stuff.
Yeah, I think we also often refer to differentiation as teaching mixed ability or mixed levels. And what came to my mind actually is that so it's not always about language ability, I think. So 3 of my students came to my mind. 2 of them has dyslexia and 1 had visual impairments,
Yep.
for instance. And so I think this had an impact on the lesson as well, because like I needed to design my tasks so that I catered for their needs as well. So the second I found out about the fact that one of my students was short-sighted, for instance, I needed to implement differentiation in my classroom, not necessarily in the content that I used, but in the classroom setting, for instance, just to make sure that she was able to see the whiteboard or what was happening on the whiteboard. Or so.
Yes. Absolutely, and I think it's also the question about it's an abstract concept, and I like this in the chat box, and there's little material out there. I think it is because in the same way that personalization is personal. So I've shown you examples of things I've done with my students, but you actually have to do it with your own class and adapt it for yourself. So I think the big thing is you do need to go the extra mile, but in my opinion, that extra mile is completely worth it. And you get paid back many times over by the benefits that you reap. And things like, particularly, for example, the dictation. Once you've done it once, it's so quick to make those kind of things again, so simple. That it could take, that task that we did, we just listened to a couple of sentences, but that's actually part of a longer text, which can be an entire hour's lesson. And really, in terms of preparing it, I mean, I'm not the world's fastest typist, but there are lots of shortcuts to things. I mean, one thing I would also recommend to people, if you don't use this, open your version of Word and check out that you've got dictate on it, because you can click on the dictate button, literally dictate your dictation to your computer, which will type it all up for you. And then off you go, you delete it all out, put in the punctuation, and job done. So these things, there are shortcuts. There's lots of ways of getting in there. Should learning styles be included in this presentation? Okay, this is, it's the bane of my life. So marking module 3 for Delta. Cambridge has decided that they really, like, learning styles have kind of gone so out of fashion when we talk about people being kinesthetic learners, or interpersonal or intrapersonal and multiple intelligences. And I think the problem is that there's not enough scientific data behind things. However, I kind of agree to disagree with this going out of style, because I do think that people clearly have ways that they have ways that they maybe enjoy learning more. That's not to say that they're necessarily more effective. And I think also sometimes people just haven't been taught how to be effective with certain techniques. So some people might have been used to a more kind of chalk and talk style. So that's what they think works for them. And they think that if they have to do things for themselves, that's not going to work. So all of this to me is about personalization, asking people what they enjoy doing, but also sometimes putting in things that maybe not that they've said they hate, but things that they haven't said they particularly like, but just so they get to try it. It's like teaching your kids to like vegetables, isn't it? At the beginning, they tell you that they're only going to eat sweet corn and the odd pea if you're lucky, but you can't then give them the rest of their life with just 2 veg. You've got to then go for other ways. You can package it differently. So I'm a real believer that enthusiasm can get a lot of things across in the classroom and help people be successful. So designing materials which will not be exactly learning preferences. Yeah, I think definitely we do sometimes do things that don't have the learning preference, which is why what I like about differentiation and personalization is that people are so different and so individual. That just gives you more variety, and the more variety you have, the more likely you are to be not spending too much time doing things in a particular way that doesn't suit one student.
Anna, for instance, just moving on, another question has just come to my mind. Exam classes. because we can use differentiation in exam classes as well, but then you may find your students telling you about the fact that, you know, but everyone is taking the same exam, so then we should be working on the same exam tasks as well. So
yeah,
in the same
but
way.
yeah, that's kind of, yes, that's true, but in the same sense, it's also kind of nonsense, because yes, you're all taking the same exam, but if you do the classic thing, which lots of teachers do, so you have an exam class and you benchmark at the beginning of the course, you just give everybody a mock. When you mark all those mocks, they're not all going to have exactly the same results. There are going to be people that found the use of English really tricky, and some people found the transformation sentences were a nightmare, and somebody else found that really easy. Somebody else found sort of a particular reading task difficult. So this is where I think, and I hope, that exam classes do tend to be taught by more experienced teachers, because I think it is quite difficult, particularly if you're teaching a whole class and you're inexperienced and you're given an exam. But this is where preparing sort of workshop materials can be really useful. So what I used to do quite a lot is have a lot of A3 envelopes. And in those A3 envelopes, each one would have a sort of package. So it would be one, these are lots of extra transformation sentences, for example, for first certificate, Cambridge Advanced English. Or maybe people are having a problem with IELTS looking at the map task. So this envelope's got lots of map tasks. So what we might do as a class is start the lesson with a little revision that would be useful for everybody, some general exam thing, might introduce a couple of bits of vocabulary, and then we'll say, right, we're going to have 10-15 minutes, and this is where everybody works on what they want to work. We've got 4 or 5 different tables, like the tables on my slides where I had the marble moving around. Each table has a different pack of material. So one's got transformation sentences, one's got another area of use of English, one's got something else, and the students choose which table they go to and what they take out. And I, as a teacher, just note down what people have chosen. And I just need to keep refilling up those photocopies and putting in extra things. And I just need to be then not teaching, but guiding and facilitating and walking around the room and just being available for questions. I wouldn't do that for an entire lesson, but for a piece of a lesson.
Okay. Thank you. And earlier in the chat room, I saw Gabi saying that she would like to hear more about grouping students, or talking about that.
Yeah, so again, I think, well, I've just given you an example that if it was a workshop, the students would choose their own groups because they would walk to the table that has the materials they want. Or if there are breakout rooms, if you're doing it online, you can say, I'm going to open 3 breakout rooms, just tell me which one you'd prefer to be in. So number 1 is going to be doing something extra with some reading skills, number 2 is going to be doing something with the use of English, or number 3 is going to do a little bit of pronunciation work. And then I would put the document, I would put the students into those breakout rooms according to their choice. And then I would be opening the chat box and sending the relevant material, or alternatively sending a lot of material beforehand and telling them which documents to access. So that could be how you could group people online. I think in a physical classroom, I mean, those of us that can move students are just so lucky, because it's not the case. I know there are loads of teaching contexts where people have no choice, they can't move things around. And that's where I say you can't meet the needs of all students all the time. So maybe you have to look over a longer period of time of, you know, have I checked in with a particular person? Have I looked at their work? Did I actually turn their book around physically and look at what they're doing rather than wait to see if they put their hand up? It is difficult. Peer teaching is difficult, but I think it's not, I think it works quite well. It's a kind of thing that you have to train your students to do. And you do need to be careful that the stronger students don't end up feeling that they're disenfranchised, that actually they're being expected to do the teaching when you're the person being paid for that. So I think, yeah, you have to be a little bit careful on that front.
Yeah. Just going back to the idea of grouping students, that you were talking about earlier, and is actually, yes, when we can't move the furniture, we can still move the students around.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, if you're lucky, although some schools don't even want you to move a person, and obviously depending on, you know, pandemics and things, you might not be able to move people, or you've got huge gaps between people. So so that's difficult. And whether you decide to group students at planning or teaching stage, I think it depends what I am intending to do. So for example, if I was doing some kind of information gap activity, or some kind of dictation, I would probably map out on a piece of paper before I get in the room, these are the people I think will be working together. I personally find it really easy to, much easier to color code things. So if I'm in a physical room and I am lucky enough to have access to different colored paper, I will photocopy things on different colored paper according to the task and students. If I don't have that, I walk around with, I've always got colored pencils with me all the time because I like doodling and scribbling. So I'll just literally put a little blue mark on the top of some papers that are going to a particular group of students. You can put a lot of people use bits of paper in their classrooms when they're getting to know students' names, you know, like when you are literally sort of folding up a piece of paper like this, and you can stick that on a table and say, this is what's happening on this table. I mean, in primary schools, I think what teachers often do is they group things and you suddenly have a group and it's like the sharks and the elephants and the giraffes, but everyone who's an elephant knows that they're sort of a weaker student, and everyone who's a giraffe knows that they're amazing. So I think you've got to be really careful that you mix it up, that you're not always going for groups of people that are higher flyers and groups of people that are, and nearly always, even students that we label sort of weaker or slower, they've usually got something that they're going to be really good at, that they're going to be able to excel in. Or you could even give them a heads up before a lesson, say, we're going to be doing this. Why don't you look at the notes the night before, so that you're not going to feel that it's all new.
Anna, when you put students into breakout rooms, when you have online lessons, for instance, so you put students into breakout rooms to work in groups, smaller groups. How many students would you put in one room?
I think this depends on your confidence with technology. So when I first started using Zoom at the beginning, it was a bit of a nightmare. So I was sort of doing 2 larger groups. Now I'm much more confident going in and out. I will go as many groups as I think are necessary. And I just need to be very quick of going in and out of each group. So I need to, first of all, when you open the rooms, just go into every single room and just think, are they sharing a screen? Are they doing what I need them to do? Make sure that they're aware that there's the option to put their hand up or ask for help so that they can call you if they're stuck, and you can then go into a room. And I think you do need to be very quick. You need to not get bogged down with one particular breakout room. And this is like being in a face-to-face classroom. And I particularly see this a lot with people that are new to teaching, trainees, where a student calls them over and asks for some help, and then they're suddenly not aware of everything else that's going on in the room. So you do need eyes in the back of your head all the time. You need to keep looking, being mindful. And the only way to do that in a breakout room is by going in and out of rooms quite quickly. So I think you need to be very careful with that. And it's up to you personally whether you feel confident with your technology and with your time management, and not to have so many groups that by the end of an activity, there's a couple of groups that you never even went to see. That's not going to work. Sometimes group leaders have a fuss about grouping students when they observe classes. Yeah. Yes. So yes, I agree. It's funny also, what I've found interesting in my teaching is when you possibly get a closed group. So maybe a group of students will come across to learn English, and that group is already taught by another teacher. And teachers can be quite territorial about their own classes, and they think, oh, I know these students, I know how they work. You know, I know where they should be. And then they're a bit surprised when you do something different. I do like to liaise with other people and get their opinions, but I do also like to sort of test things for myself. And also I think interesting that getting students to mix. So I guess the question here in the chat box is about when you get students, for example, you get a group of Swiss students that come to the UK and they're in a language school, and there are people that speak lots of different languages. So they really want to mix those students up to get them to talk every second of every minute using English only and never using their mother tongue. And what I would say is this depends on the level of the student and their confidence, because I think it is cognitively exhausting working in another language, which is why it's really important to use things like dual coding, why it's important to ask students, shall I stop? What's the pace? Looking at all of this. And I would challenge some of those teachers that say that to go and, for example, be immersed in a class in China for 3 lessons in a row where they're not allowed to speak any of their native tongue, and then see. I think we have unrealistic expectations sometimes about how much a person can take on board in a day of learning in those multilingual classes.
Exactly. And during your presentation, Anna, you showed us a lesson plan.
Yeah.
As well, and that makes me think, and actually what makes me think is the learning objectives of the lesson plan. So when we implement differentiation in our classes, then will it have an impact on how we phrase the learning outcomes?
Not necessarily. Well, I think the learning outcome always needs to be what the core thing is. So when we were looking at that core meaning, what is the basic thing that we want everybody to do? So that would be my sort of main aim or objective. And then my subsidiary aims could potentially be differentiated, that some people are going to do things, but I don't tend to write that. So when we do CELTA or Delta lessons, we tend to write a front sheet or a top sheet where we have that sort of main aim and objective. And I guess don't necessarily write so much about the differentiation. It's more in the lesson plan. But what I would say, for example, on CELTA, Delta and similar courses, when we're looking at candidates that are getting higher grades, it's often because they have got that degree of flexibility in a plan. Because the worst thing that somebody can say to me at the end of a lesson when you're getting feedback is, oh, I got through my plan. Like, well, good for you. It's like, you've eaten your dinner. Did you actually enjoy it? Was it nutritionally useful? Was it good for you? It's not about completing things. It's about what you get out of it. So I'd rather somebody said, well, I didn't get through my plan, but I stopped at this point because I saw that everybody was lost and I got my plan wrong and I actually needed to have another go. Or I stopped my plan here because I put in a flexi stage and we had to use it. Therefore, we didn't get to the end of our plan. And I think I think giving yourself flexibility as a teacher is really important. I do think it's very easy for me to say that as an experienced trainer. When you are new to teaching, it's much harder to do. And I think this is something that becomes progressively easier with experience, really. Students that don't want to mix with students from other nationalities, I think that's a really interesting one. I think this is about having private conversations with people, and this is about finding why somebody is on a course in the first place. We've had in the past sometimes people saying, well, I only want to work with, what's the point of working with a student whose English isn't as good as mine, or who's got a strange accent? I don't understand. But actually, the vast majority of English spoken in the world is between two non-native speakers, and not a native speaker and a non-native speaker. You're more likely maybe to need to understand a Japanese speaker than you are to understand somebody else who speaks your own language. So I think, you know, it's tricky. And I think all of these things about students staying with their friends, all of this is a whole other session, because this is about how do you create a positive climate for learning? Because if your learning climate is good enough, people will want to be with you, whether they are with their friends or not with their friends, or whatever the nationality is. It's about having lessons that are really engaging, really personalized, really motivating. And then hopefully all of this stuff kind of becomes peripheral and it's less important.
Yes, and as we are getting to the end of this session, Anna, do you have any final thoughts about, I don't know, ways to differentiate without having to spend too much time, hours on preparation?
I think just even verbally, so just go into your lessons or go onto your online classes and sit with a piece of paper literally next to you. I mean, I taught a lesson this morning and I've literally got a piece of paper where I've been sort of jotting down, these are the people's names. They happen to say something in a breakout room. I jotted down what they said. I heard somebody say one thing and I'm thinking, right, well, tomorrow I'm going to bring up the fact that Rory mentioned that he loves football because I heard him say that. And I'm kind of then saying, well, you are important to me. What you're interested in is important to me. So I think just keeping all those little snippets, having post-it notes, things like that. You don't have to prepare a different lesson. Often we use anecdotes, often we use pictures, just spontaneously trying to talk about things that are relevant to the people that are in your class or in your room.